So my paper addresses the emotional side of Edwards and how it affected his ministry. I break it down into 5 different points, and firstly I talk about Edwards' background in his emotional journey to salvation. He was very unsure of his salvation growing up, and this contributed to how he viewed others' saving grace that God gives them. So his private journal also shows his emotional side. He praises God a lot in his journal, talks about his connection with God, but also he talks about depression, and just a direct quote from one of his journals here. "'Tis just about 3 years that I have been, for the most part, in a low, sunk estate and condition, miserably senseless to what I used to be about spiritual things." Secondly, I go into contributing factors and life circumstances that encouraged emotional response in Edwards. So he had a large family to care for, a big responsibility. This brought on financial struggles, especially when Northampton, their relationship became strained, and his salary was not as consistent or as much as he needed to care for his growing family. So this was just one of the multiple strains between Edwards' relationship with Northampton congregation. And then I talk about some of the other issues there as far as Edwards' way of dealing with sin in the church, and the disagreements with church membership and communion. The culture was progressing forward, but Edwards was sticking to traditional Puritan views. Thirdly, he utilized emotion in his preaching and expected emotional responses. When he gave the sermon Sinners, for example, people showed a physical and emotional response, even shrieking and wailing. Fourthly, these sermons were not pessimistic messages, but preparatory, even compassionate. In that day, the Puritans were very familiar with death, and they were very aware, and that shows even in the New England Primer. The alphabet Y stands for youth forward slips, death soonest nips. So Edwards' sermons were not as, although they were emotional, they weren't as pessimistic as they may sound to some people today, but more compassionate. And I also talk about Edwards' optimism. In my 5th point, Edwards is very aware of God's sovereignty and sees the end times coming, and God using the revivals at Northampton to ignite this. He viewed them as a city on a hill, which is more support of Edwards being compassionate and warning the people when he does give the harsh sermons about how God has chosen them, but they need to live within his will. And my conclusion of the paper is Edwards' emotional characteristics and expression of those heavily affected his ministry. It affected his communication with his congregation and his sermons. His understanding of conversion was emotionally laden, and this showed forth within Northampton revivals. Although some difficult circumstances of Edwards' life may have made him seem pessimistic or depressed, in his belief in God's sovereignty in the salvation of the world showed his optimism.